everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait a minute or two before we get started. So just hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining today. And there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the left side of your screen. There's a little box with a question mark. You can go ahead and type in your questions there, and we'll be able to answer them during the Q&A. So now I'm going to pass it over to Seth to get started.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this presentation of Demystifying the FDA Cyber Guidance. It's my pleasure to have you folks here and to hopefully have an engaging conversation, albeit virtually, about the FDA's most recent policy document on cybersecurity, released in April of 2022. So without further ado, let's get started. I had this idea that the FDA is really a policy as a service organization, which then led me to the acronym PAS. And I was like, well, they could be platform as a service, but I don't know about you, but I always think about the Easter egg dying company PAS. Now, I have questions about this. I'm like, what's their market strategy? Do they make anything else? I'm sure I could Google it, but if you feel like having fun, somebody put in the chat, what does that company do? Maybe it's a subsidiary. I don't know, but just a thought. I am Seth Carmody. I'm the VP of Regulatory Strategy at MedCrypt. Here I am in 2011 as a bench PhD organic chemist. This is the day I defended my PhD. I moved on to the FDA, working principally using those chemistry skills in Chemistry and Tox Division at Center for Devices, working in the diabetes space. I eventually transitioned over to tech policy writing, including architecting a slew of cybersecurity guidances, including co-creating the vision that is bound up in the 2022 version with my colleagues that are still at the FDA. In 2021, I released a white paper entitled "Why Healthcare Cybersecurity is Hard." There may be some collective eye rolls from folks in the crowd. I want to make sure we hit that and emphasize the key concepts that are in there because they're important to understand why the FDA is doing what they're doing. It's also really critical in order to project and sort of play the futuristic game of what will they be doing in the near future. Specifically, that cybersecurity is a hard discipline. It's not properly incentivized in the market, so consumers aren't properly incentivized or incentivize producers of technology to reduce security debt. Consumers buy all sorts of it, specifically in the healthcare field. Not because anybody's doing anything wrong. This is a tragedy of the commons from an economic perspective. That debt accrues, both technical and security debt. Problems manifest, and that leaves the consumers to pay for those problems. But the problem is that money, that spend, has its effectiveness dissipates with the square of the radius, right? It just dissipates really quickly. It doesn't actually fix the debt. It just manages the risk associated with that debt. And we're, as a healthcare industry, we're focused on things like pandemics. You want your healthcare delivery organizations focused on pandemic. We can look at all sorts of things that happened during the pandemic that show exactly this issue, including the pandemic breaking financial models and causing healthcare delivery organizations to roll back IT budgets, which is, I mean, the problem set is both simultaneously maddening, but completely understandable, right? The other, and this is something that I've sort of added, this is what an addendum to the white paper, I guess, is to say, and that is cybersecurity's infrastructure. Like, nobody wants to pay for infrastructure. It's not fun. It's about as fun as filling potholes. We just want to get in our cars. We want to drive to wherever we're going. We don't want to pay for patching potholes, for sure. But we need this investment to sort of shift left to the supply chain. We want it to go from the $20 billion plus or minus a few billion that consumers spend, including hospitals, on security or trying to secure the technology which they have to consume, and shift that up the supply chain to tech and manufacturers, so that they actually can, healthcare institutions can actually have a shot at using their dollars to actually secure it. Again, it's a tragedy of the commons, and we see that actually manifesting today, in that regulators, the FDA and Congress, are actually stepping up their game. The political winds are shifting. Oh, I see this typo right here, FBO. Who's that? I'm not sure. It's a new government entity. Maybe they're in charge of cybersecurity. They're shifting their efforts basically in creating these market incentives for the tech sector and the medical device manufacturers or other producers of technology to invest in cybersecurity. Speaking of, that segue was by design, regulatory market incentives. The regulator, having been one, I think I can speak with some authority here. The regulator and the model that the FDA specifically uses to regulate medical devices doesn't work well for cybersecurity. And I'm not the only person that thinks that. I have here pictured is my former boss, Jeff Shuren, who actually came out publicly, said, hey, look, this regulatory model isn't fit for purpose. And why isn't it fit for purpose? The white paper goes into this in some detail. Computers are not pills, right? And the regulatory model that CDRH, Center for Devices, uses to regulate medical devices is based largely on good manufacturing practices, which is essentially the regulation of a static deterministic system, a pill. And it doesn't fit all the cool technologies that are emerging in the medical device space at the moment. Now, regulators, including myself, tried their hardest to retrofit that model by producing a slew of the policy documents, including, and not pictured here, the 2014, actually the only active pre-market guidance from 2014, the draft in 2018, which, by the way, its link disappeared. The link is still there, but you can't go access it. So hopefully you shared your copy. I have some available at a price, obviously just joking, for the 2018 version. The 2022 is which is the subject of what we'll be talking about today. I call it draft or draft squared. I'll take any other mathematical formulas that make sense. But we'll start to dig in here. But we'd be remiss if I didn't mention the post-market guidance, which came out in 2016. Its policies were largely sort of codified in 2015 in terms of what the structure of that document would be. So that's 7 years ago. I think we're due for a refresh, maybe after the final pre-market, or the pre-market goes final. So let's dig in. Again, if you folks have any questions, I don't know if the format works well for you to pump them in here right now, but feel free to get them in there. I'll be checking periodically. So let's dig in. So for folks who have done policy writing before, it's a really cool problem. It's really fascinating. It exercises all the parts of my brain that I like to exercise. But basically what we're doing is we're building a framework, right? We're building a framework for people to sort of go back to, sort of a waypoint. It's not giving you the specifics, it's flexible, but it sort of identifies those things, those anchor points, right, that you have to operate from. And then you sort of figure out, as the entity who's the subject of that policy or law, how do I go implement this? The cybersecurity has been particularly tough because, and one of the aims or objectives of the 2022 document was really to create a framework that blends everything that we know about making a product secure in sort of adding a measure or meshing in the quality system regulations, or essentially the existing statutory authority of the Food and Drug Administration. Now, remember that unlike other regulators, like say the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, that bound which the FDA regulates in terms of healthcare technology is different, right? And in the US, and I talk about this in the white paper, it's kind of fractured, right? You have the FDA over safety and efficacy. You've got other parts of HHS doing different things around privacy or around electronic health records or what have you. So it's kind of fractured. But as a policy writer, you gotta operate within the law and make ties and justifications based on what that existing law is. And then further complicating the fact is, and I mentioned this in the broken model, is that the current regulations, while flexible, really are sort of bound in this deterministic system where things aren't changing, right? Or at least they're not changing rapidly, right? So how do we build this really complex framework? By the way, there's a name for the shape that I had. It's I want to call it a hyperisocahedron or something like that. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat. Can't remember it off the top of my head. We take that framework, that complex framework, and we meld it with sort of this time. I was thinking like Tesseract. I don't want to go into animations. You know how presentations can fall apart. But this idea of melding in time and it's in motion, if we can blend those two things appropriately together, I think we can end up with something that works. The second sort of or third objective, I'm not sure what number of objectives I'm on now, is that we need to take all that complexity and we need to distill it out so that we can talk about it to different, either internally to different parts of our organization or externally to a variety of folks, but specifically that this policy document, 2022 draft Premarket Cybersecurity Guidance, talk to regulators and communicate all that complexity of designing a device securely and tell them in an efficient way. And that is really one of the objectives of the document, is really how do we tell an efficient story? The document itself doesn't look efficient, and maybe we're going to take some iterations in order to get to a document that allows us to tell a story efficiently. But there's got to be some distillation process to tell it. So starting at the beginning, right, or the framer of the framework, that was this concept of secure product development framework, right? So SPDF. Now, acronyms aside, it's really I'll go into in a second why that name was thought about. And I think I saw Ken Hoyme on the phone. Hey Ken, him and I have always had discussions about terminology. As a policy writer, you take chances on the terms that you use. If anybody remembers essential clinical performance from the post-market guidance draft, those are the types of things you try to blend when you try to blend things together, concepts together that people recognize. That's what you end up with. I talked about quality system regulations. Here they are in all their glory. If you look at the headers, you might find you find some alignment between what you're trying to do from a security perspective and where it falls or could be slotted in FDA's current jurisdictional authority. Then you take the you take this idea of beg, borrow, and steal from what other security organizations or security-minded organizations have done, and why not go to the source? We all know that Microsoft created the problem of cybersecurity, and then in a brilliant strategic marketing move, also decided that they were going to fix the problem. Obviously, I'm saying this partially in jest, but look at how they defined their SDL, right? Their secure development lifecycle. It's really to drive down the number and severity of vulnerabilities in software, right? And right there in that definition, you see why secure product development framework is a term that was necessary. If you go, systematically look at all the acronyms and names that are around sort of this development process, and then, by the way, do it securely, it starts to get a little messy. So secure product development framework was what was the coined phrase. And NIST, after I departed and sort of, thought that this was a decent idea, NIST came out with their own framework and called it the framework. So thank you, NIST. Maybe maybe I talked to somebody at a conference, but I just want to make it known for the record that it was me first. Obviously, I'm saying this partially in jest. Okay, so if we continue on this road, and there's many frameworks. We can talk about frameworks all day. I did a deep dive in frameworks back when I was researching this stuff. Gary McGraw's touch points, right, is another example of a secure software development framework. I think there was another one I saw yesterday, CLASP. Okay, there are multitudes of frameworks that we could sort of beg, borrow, and steal from. And if we want to go medical device specific, and I think it even says this in the guidance a couple of times, the Joint Security Plan from the HSCC, an industry specific attempt at a secure development framework. As I understand, that's going through revision. So you can, it's kind of this groundswell. That's where the industry was moving. If we look at the elements here from just a quick example of Microsoft, we start to see alignment, right? Things are even named the same. Well, it's not an accident, right? That we're beg, borrowing, and stealing. So to kind of summarize what is going on here, if you take the QSR, and I don't know if this is division or you take it over the total product lifecycle, so quality system regulation over the total product lifecycle, you end up with a safe product, right? There are caveats, but this is generally what we're trying to aim for. Now, if you take the QSRs, you sprinkle in a little some stuff from the processes from the secure product development framework, you take that over the total product lifecycle, and the hypothesis is you end up with safe and secure product. Cool. So I think that set us up for success. We framed the framework. We framed where FDA is coming from. I think if we just start to dive into the particulars and start to deconstruct what the FDA is actually asking for and demystify a little bit, that's where I'd like to start with scope. I kind of in reviewing these slides, it kind of had the air of, well, Seth went through the little sticky notes, and I think that's good, right? I went through with the sticky notes and I put a bunch of sticky notes in place just as sort of points of order or things that I found interesting or things that we need to work on or submit as comments. So starting with the scope, there's two major things in here. There's some other scope-like elements that I want to talk about, but the first one is notice, and if you remember from the 2018 version, it went to great pains to sort of make the policy dependent on whether something was connected or not, right? Well, right here in line 3 of the scope, it says, hey, I don't care if you're connected. And I love this. Now it's draft, and if you don't like it, you can, there are ways to sort of get this out of here. But the idea here is this is just reflecting reality. We talk with clients all the time that are designing devices that are not supposed to be connected, and that the future state is connected. But when you design a device to not be connected and you say, well, that's how I'm scoping my cybersecurity efforts, yeah, that makes sense. But then when you go to V2, then you have to go back. Like, what are the incentives? And the incentives are basically zero, if not negative, right? So how do we out of the gate when we're building devices make a clean policy, make it easier for folks? It's just like you're in scope, right? So get yourself under the secure product development framework. Get it embedded into the QSRs in your quality system, quality management system, and then off you go. The rest of the document is designed to scale the risk, right? So if you are in a sort of non-connected, semi-connected intranet, or some sort of subset of internet facing, that you can scale your risk posture and your design posture to that reality, but you're not out of the scope of the guidance because you're not connected. The second main thing is really important. This gets to the concept of timing. Investigational device exemptions are now in scope. As a policy writer, I had a lot of conversations internally about why IDE should be in scope. And the reason is, and I get it, and I don't want to burden folks who are really trying to focus on bringing unique and advanced features to market, and they're just trying to try it out and gather some evidence or do clinical study and sort of put some meat behind the philosophy or theory. Why do I have to worry about security when I'm in such a a nascent development state? And then the fact is just like I said, from terms of going connected or not, right? Once you have that base design, chances are that gets carried along, and to go back and to retrofit is costly. And sometimes maybe it makes sense, but I think what we have observed, or as I observed in my days at the FDA, that it just wasn't worth it to get that far along and then go to, say, FDA submission and say, hey, look, this isn't sufficient. And now everything that was contingent upon that submission, including any data that was gathered during a clinical study, is null. Like, nobody wants to be in that position. Another scope thing, which I thought was interesting, was a decoupling from the software guidances. I don't know if that was adequately done. It's a hard problem from a policy writer because software is so intimately linked with cybersecurity. And then you do see some touch points that are specifically called out. I'll show that in a future slide. So we talked about scope, which is super important when you're policy writing. You talk a lot about scope. It takes forever. I'm sure that, I know there are folks that do standards here in the audience. It can be a laborious process. Transitioning now to threat model. Threat model sort of is the framer. There's some sort of recursion in here. It's from a policy perspective. I'm going to go through this all linearly. There's feedback loops. There's overlaps, right? So I try my best to sort of tell the story in a linear narrative. Threat model has, I love the framers from OWASP. What are we doing? What can go wrong? What are we doing about it? And how do we know we did a good job? They're great framers for this talk as well. Threat modeling, its origin story is not from the FDA, but if you look back, if anybody can take a guess at what document I have up on the screen, what vintage policy document this is, what is it? Put your answers in the chat. You have 20 seconds before I tell you what the answer is. What policy document first mentions threat modeling from the FDA? I should have had a poll question. I don't know how to operate the poll. I just don't. Oh, 2014, guys. I like that. Thank you for participating. Oh, another 2014. That would be the Premarket. Yep. Anybody else? Final thoughts? 3, 2, 1. Actually, good guess to this from 2014, but this is actually from the 2016 post-market guidance. Now, thinking back to my days, working on this particular document, I saw the concept of threat modeling. I'm like, this is vaguely important. I'm not really sure how to articulate it. So when push came to shove in terms of document, putting this in policy, didn't know where it fit, didn't know how to articulate it, but we all kind of knew it was important. Hey, it's in the appendix, right? So you'll find in the appendix of the post-market, which is very interesting. The 2018 pre-market, you find it's much more emphasized. It's in the risk management part, which makes sense. If you think about what threat modeling is to serve, what purpose it is to serve. And then delightfully, it's still in the 2022 draft. It's expanded in terms of how it talks about what threat modeling is and what it should look like, but it continues on. So it doesn't tell you how to do it necessarily, just tells you sort of what should the output satisfy. The FDA in conjunction with MITRE and NBIC did put out a threat modeling playbook to help folks start to threat model. As an industry, we are sort of nascent in this space, and growing out our skill sets can be fundamental to actually doing it well, do it comprehensively. And there are resources out there to get that done. And I won't go into the specifics of it, except to show you an example. So threat modeling, the first question of threat modeling is, what are we building? And this sort of drives directly into the architecture part of the guidance. So if you look at an example threat model, and I scraped this from Synopsys, thank you folks, Synopsys folks. I'm not calling this out as a bad threat model. It's perfectly valid. It's got a lot of information in here. It can be a communication tool. It can help people, the designers, learn about their own devices and things that they need to worry about. It can communicate internally, and it can be used to communicate externally. There's just one problem with it. It's complicated, and it lacks context, right? There's a lot of information in here. It's not like, what does it do? What is this thing doing? I'm not really sure. No, Synopsys didn't start out with necessarily that idea in mind. They're just saying, hey, we do threat modeling services. But here it might be an example of something, an output that you might have from your teams when you do threat model. So that and having experienced this both as a reviewer and as a policy writer inside FDA, this architecture section deriving from, again, beg, borrowing, stealing from the security community around system security engineering, or NIST 800-160 Volume 1, but, borrowing their framework, borrowing their terminology, so we didn't have to invent anything. I don't know if it's the right terminology, right? These ideas of system views, or security use cases or things like that, or what information will be relevant, whether you need to identify all interfaces on a document. How do you do that cleanly? Like, those are open questions. But this idea of it's just decompositional analysis. You've got a complex thing. You got to break it down into parts so that you can understand it and so other people can understand it. That's really what it's saying, just borrowing on terminology from the security community. And I think it's valid. And I'll go through an example here from an engine. Now this, by the way, who doesn't love engineering? I mean, look at this thing. It's a 3-story diesel engine. Theoretically, I can't remember what the name of it is. Feel free to post it if people want to Google it. The biggest diesel engine in the world. It might have been surpassed by now. I don't know, but it's a 3-story diesel engine. When you're measuring engines in stories, yeah, that's cool. That's cool engineering. Excuse me. But this is a big complex machine, right? How can anybody understand what it's doing or what it needs to, what the security posture of this particular engineered thing will be or should be without breaking it down? And if we break it down in its constituent parts, and can even go further than this, but we have this grainy photo of pistons. I'm not sure if this is actually from this thing, but they look big enough. They're a room-sized piston. We'll take it. And then a camshaft, basically. I think this actually is from that same engine. But we have component parts, right? And they're both doing a job, but we don't have the complete, like, what is this thing doing, right? And if we think about the views that we'll end up putting into documentation to the FDA, it's probably going to look something like this, right? Where I'm saying, hey, here are the parts and pieces. Here's the overall thing, the engine. Here are the parts and pieces, and here's how they're interacting together to accomplish some function, right? So in terms of the Carnot cycle, intake, compression, and power and exhaust, and now I have something contextualized, right? So if I start to put information into here, I can interpret that information through the context of its use case, right? And that's really all that that architecture section is trying to say. Continuing down, kind of as an offshoot of what are we building, is like, what are we building with? I've already showed the giant piston and camshaft from the world's largest diesel engine. Naturally leads into what are we building with in terms of SBOM. Now, tongue in cheek here, it was CBOM, it went to SBOM. Cybersecurity bill of materials was meant to include hardware that was could be vulnerable to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Whole bunch of conversations ensued, comments from the draft, 2018 draft. It's gone to software bill of materials. That's not because hardware is not important. It's because we're not there yet, and I tend to agree. If we look at some of the specifics that are talked about in this document around SBOM, I think there was a lot of consternation from folks about, well, it's describing parameters of information that aren't in SBOM. They don't reflect what the industry has been essentially saying should be in an SBOM, and that's true, right? It's like SBOM plus. And the reason why, and certainly, like, we could probably pretty easily cleave the section into here's what's in, here's what the industry is saying is needed in an SBOM, and here's some additional information that we need to overlay on that SBOM in order to make safety and efficacy and security decisions at the FDA. And you can imagine, I'll just take element A here, where does that software component reside? I think, and maybe the hypothesis is, and maybe it's a hypothesis, is that from a threat model perspective, from an exploitability perspective, from a risk and harm perspective, and I mean those in the broadest of senses, where that software is matters, right? Where it is in that system matters. If it's on a networking component or if it's on a pump controller unit, like, the risk is probably different. Maybe it's the same, but the context matters. Name, version, manufacturer, those are things that are typically found in an SBOM. Whether they're supported or not, I can't remember if that's made it into any of the standards to date. But those are, those are important, right? Like, knowing when something becomes unsupported actually is important information. Is it part of current standards? I don't know, but the FDA is saying it is important to us. So maybe there's an SBOM and then an SBOM plus. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm sure that we'll figure it out. And then this idea of any known vulnerabilities, the idea that I need to know what I'm building with because that is a function of risk, right? That I have possibly known vulnerabilities in my software, and that could lead to risks down the road. Then I need to know that, and the FDA, as a risk-based organization, also needs to know that. I have not taken enough time to talk about SBOM. Don't have enough time to talk about it. We can do an entire presentation about SBOM if we wanted. We could probably do an entire conference about SBOM. Just let me know in the chat if you want to do a separate SBOM conference. Moving on, I love this section about unresolved anomalies. Remember when we scoped out that this document it wasn't connected to software in any way. It actually is in specific ways, and that in those guidance documents around software, it says, hey, tell me what your unresolved anomalies are, which I generally think of as bugs. You know, correct me if I'm wrong. There's always bugs in software. So the FDA, in terms of submitting to them for a device, would say, hey, look, tell me what the impact of this particular bug is for safety and efficacy. There's a natural connection to, well, what is that? Is that bug? Well, if it's not safety and efficacy, is it security, right? And we can talk about the relationships of all of them together. But fundamentally, like there will be bugs or anomalies that are in the software that would be necessarily go in a table that you would submit to FDA. I guess submit to FDA that could be security issues too. And FDA is saying, hey, by the way, make an assessment of those. And it's kind of nonchalant in a way, right? It's like, hey, just make this, take all your anomalies and make safe security assessments of them. So, we've gone through what are we building. We've talked about architecture and the way that FDA wants to present architecture. We talked about SBOM as a function of like, what are we building and what are we using to build it with? What are we going to do about it? Is the next question that makes sense from a threat modeling perspective. The document roughly starts around security risk management, so we'll start there. Again, this is not a comprehensive view of everything that's in the document, just a couple of things pointers that I'll point out with my sticky tabs here. One, it's kind of, the top one is about scope, right? It's saying, by the way, security is a function of the system, right? And we could parse terms in terms of, is it a function of the system or is it emergent or whatever? But the idea is that as an industry, we're focused on regulation of the device, of the thing that's classified by regulation as the device. As we know from experience, that device is impacted by the things that are connected to it from a safety perspective, but more importantly, from a security perspective. The bounds are different than when we're talking about safety. So we have to assess the entire system. And it's, again, kind of said nonchalantly. I think people have been feeling this as they've gone through the FDA. It's like, well, I know this is the device, but what's it connected to? This ID and scope shift necessitates that when we look at it from an architectural perspective, that we do decompositional analysis, right? Because how else are we going to talk about this in an effective way if we don't? Maybe your device is simple enough and your decomposition analysis is also your system view, but we have to have ways in order to tell the story, and this is just one of the ways. Obviously, maybe non-obvious, the industry's baked around ISO 14971 or risk management for medical devices. It's necessary but insufficient. We could talk all day about security risk assessments and how to do them. That's not the subject for today, but the idea that you need one is what the FDA is asking for. It's driven by threat modeling and a bunch of other processes. How you do that is for you to work out. There are standards. I'm not up to date 100% on where TIR 57 is. I'm not sure if it got combined or it's not a TIR anymore. I'm sure there's folks in the chat that could tell you about that. But the idea is that there are ways, the guidances, or standards that sort of guide you around, what does a security risk management program or process or processes look like. The third point that I'll make is, and this is harkening back to, I can't remember where this first came out in policy, but the idea of getting away from probabilistic risk assessments, which is something that ISO 14971 does, right? Assigning numbers is fraught with peril, and some would say it's a trap, and that we need to get away from that, but in some way assign things that represent feasibility so that we can get our arms around what the nature of any particular risk is. Cool. Obviously, risk assessments, I mean, we could, again, do a conference unto itself, but I'm just going to push off onto what are we doing about it with security controls and what the guidance is talking about with respect to those. When I look at this list of things to what the control categories are. I kind of bucket them into three categories. I'm not sure if that's clean enough, but at least that's what I'm going with now. When I see authentication, authorization, code data, execution integrity, and confidentiality, I think cryptography. So I'd sort of abstract up to that. I look at event detection and logging separately, and then resilience, recovery, and updatability, patchability sort of in the same bucket. So when I think about the kinds of controls that would go on a device to sort of, cover your bases, that's where I start to think. Obviously, we could talk very much in depth about, security controls, but I think at a high level, at an abstract level, whether you are building, a robot, a surgical robot, you're building some sort of radiation oncology device, or devices or system, you're, building a full-size, lab automation system, full lab automation system, pacemaker, any device. The idea is right sizing, that we don't ignore maybe a thermometer that's on the shelf at CVS where there is risk, but maybe it's not connected. Maybe it's Bluetooth connected, right? So this idea that we get rid of that we can just sort of notionally go, I don't care about security because I'm making X. That's where we try to depart from. Now, if we remember, this is all in result. This is everything that I've talked about so far has been in response to replacing the tiers, a priori risk tiers that were in the 2018 version, right? The idea that if you are a class 1 cybersecurity device, you do X. If you're a class 2 cybersecurity device, you do, you're supposed to do X, but we will accept a rationale why you're not, right? So if you get rid of that stuff, you got to replace it with something, right? And the idea that was landed on was, if you're making a thermometer, if you're making a temperature sensor, context matters. And you can't get rid of your cybersecurity responsibility. You have to think about it. Now, your threat modeling documentation for your thermometer that lives in CVS versus some safety critical control loop probably looks different, right? And that's fine. But we have to reflect that, we can't just ignore the cybersecurity component. We can't say, it's not connected. We can't say, it's just a thermometer, like the risk isn't hard. Well, okay, great. Well, then your documentation from a security perspective is going to be low. Hypothesis, by the way. Cool. So Section 5 of the 2018 document basically housed all of the cybersecurity control recommendations and verbiage. It's now moved to the appendix. That makes sense. It's largely the same. It's kind of changed, and it's all in service. And I could have mentioned this at the beginning because designing for security and the objectives happened before in the document. This is all to meet some objective, right? Like this idea that there's just, or you call it properties. I'm not sure how to parse that, but the idea is we just know that we need to do something with respect to security. We need these certain properties or objectives. We need ways to achieve them. There's probably, I don't know if there's strengths of achieving them or like degrees of achieving them. I won't get into that. But I like that idea. Like, let's design to objectives, let's settle on what they are or drive what they are. And then the second part is, and this is really important, this gets to the thermometer or temperature sensor control loop example that I used, is what is the context? What is this thing being used for, right? So it's like, so it's very security centric, and then it gets medical device centric, and I do like that. Furthering our discussion about what are we going to be doing about it, maintenance, and we could call this whatever. I'm calling it maintenance. We'll go with it. If you're really disgusted by my categorization, throw it in the comments. We'll talk about it. This idea that, and this gets to the properties or objectives, is that we need to be updatable. Now, I will throw one caveat before I launch, and that is that as a society, patching seems like a good way to sort of have a maintenance mode or to reduce risk. Obviously, it's fraught with a whole bunch of issues, right? Like, can we even patch fast enough? My colleague Axel Worth says we're not going to be able to patch fast enough. Okay, well, okay, probably true. But what other option do we have? Now, when I was at the FDA, we encountered examples where we basically had to rip and replace, right? And that's not easy either, because you're basically saying, I'm taking this therapy away, and providing an option to replace, but that is not, you just don't, how, just somebody walk mentally through what that would actually require to go take things off the market and then try to replace them. There's costs and other, getting to know the technology. That's non-zero cost in order to do that. So it's not necessarily feasible either. And that thing could have been fixed with a software update. So why not get this into the objectives or properties of the device? And I tried this giant arrow here to say, like, hey, all these bullets really look important. This idea that, I've encountered many devices as a regulator that just weren't necessarily updatable for a whole bunch of reasons, which make total sense. Like when you are designing a device and you're trying to, looking at the economics of it, how much extra memory do you put on it, right? Or how much more do we pay for that extra processing power if we don't need it? And the answer is, any sane or rational business would be like, we're not. Until there's sufficient market incentive to do so. So adding the extra memory, adding extra processing power, expecting that you're going to need to do updates and getting that into, say, hardware design cycle or hardware purchasing conversations makes total sense. And that's where those things start to get locked down. So it's good to have this in a document that can be read before that happens. Furthering the maintenance idea here, vulnerability management plans, right? So this idea that, hey, we know that you're going to have vulnerabilities in this thing, no matter how well you do, no matter how clean your code is that goes out, you're going to have vulnerabilities as the device sits on the market. And then we all know in our space, it can run decades or more than traditional IT. And I say, so now continuing on, what are we going to be doing about it? We move through a bunch of different categories. I'm kind of in the use environment right now, but that's fine, right? The idea is, it's like, well, Seth, this is a pre-market guidance. Why is the FDA so concerned with post-market stuff? And the idea is like, look, and some of you on the call have lived through the pain, post-market pain. Okay, so as a policy writer, how can I, given statutory authority, start saying, hey, you know what? If you want to avoid this pain over here, which is super painful, I would like to do that. Hey, why don't we do this thing over here pre-market? Really? So that's what we're talking about here. So monitoring part one, it's a bigger section. I just want to point out one thing with respect to what are we going to be doing about it, and that is you got to capture some data, right? Forensically, sound and things like that. Maybe that's debatable. That's part of the threat model. Like, do we need to make sure that we can't tamper with logs and things like that? Yeah, probably. I can't say for certain without looking at any of your stuff. But the idea of if we don't notice anything, we're not logging, stuff could be happening, and we're like, oh, well, nothing happened. We're like, what number did you call? Like, what did you look for? What did you collect? If the answer is 0, then we actually can't really say anything. We don't have any evidence, right? Continuing on with our maintenance, labeling. So this is I'm going to short shrift this section for purposes of time, but suffice it to say is your devices, your products go live with somebody else. You're generally not the owner operator. It is statutorily, the statutory authority of the FDA is like, hey, look, you need to tell people how to use this thing. I'm making broad brushstrokes here. Otherwise, that's illegal, right? It's misbranding, and it's breaking the law, right? So this idea that it's a natural consequence of cybersecurity that I may need to tell my users they need to do something. Maybe it's configuration, maybe it's check this, like maybe it's install that, maybe it's like this is your responsibility, or like here, this is how you set it up in a subnet, or like whatever. You need to tell your customers to do that. Otherwise, essentially you're leaving it to chance that they'll install, that they'll install it correctly with cybersecurity vendor. And I think finally, resiliency, this idea that, what are we going to do about it? We plan for failure. So when we're building these devices, we have to say, hey, look, we are, and this is why the sticky note is here, we need a safety margin against unknown future vulnerabilities. And I say vulnerabilities, but just like any failure, like expect this thing to fail, right? And what is it going to look like? What are the things that we need to do when we're thinking about building out this device to have resiliency? That was a large section. I'm going to take a drink right now. It was satisfying. It really was. So moving on to the last question, how do we know we did a good job? We're going to go into the testing section. I'm going to show it in its entirety. I'm going to say a couple of things. What I've heard is, and this is not an admonishment, is that the FDA is really asking for a lot of pen tests, right? And I think, if I think back, I wouldn't call myself a cybersecurity testing expert by any stretch, but this idea that, oh, when I want to test the cybersecurity of some product, it's pen test all the way, right? And I think what I've liked in it is that there's this recognition that it's not just about pen testing, right? That there are, traditional methods, ways, testing regimes, development processes that help you achieve security properties, right? And just having requirements and testing to those requirements makes sense. Obviously, in some instances, you do need, independence of testers to try to look at things. But the idea that it's all about pen testing is, erroneous, right? You need other, you need to recognize what's done. And I hope that if people find this section sort of confusing or they're missing something, that those definitely go in the comments. I know that would be helpful, as a policy writer. Again, organic chemist, I'm finding my way into the testing regimes, but helping those folks out and telling them what they're actually missing might be helpful. It was the thinnest section. It looks like it grew out a great deal. But the idea here is, how do we know we did a good job? How do we know that the security controls that we implemented are working? How do we know that we're gathering evidence, forensically sound evidence capture, right? Like there's some testing regime, there's some tests that can be done to validate that. And what I tell folks is the importance of that control necessitates the level of concern, and I'm using level of concern very broadly, not in the FDA sense, of what you should do, right? So do I need a pen test? Well, is it your primary control to your crown jewels? You might want to get some independent thought on that particular issue. One other note before I pivot out of testing is talks about providing essentially reports unaltered from the pen testers. Now it's really interesting because I guess what they're saying is, I don't want your interpretation. I want to see what the pen tester is. That there is a tension here in that some pen testing firms don't necessarily, they just like tell you everything that's wrong. They won't contextualize it. So who's providing the contextualization? The report goes to the FDA, either looking at it going, this is the worst thing that ever happened, or at the very least, I need additional context. How do I walk back from here? It's that walking back process which becomes onerous, or can become onerous. All right. I think we're approaching the end here. Monitoring part 2, there's this one thing I want to call out here in the idea of how do we know that we did a good job? And this is getting back to some of the early things that I said in the talk about our model, our regulatory model is not fit for purpose. If you look at all of the regulation around monitoring, right, this idea of observing failure in a way that makes sense at a scale and time that makes sense, I don't think we've fully captured the value on designing devices to notify when issues come up, right? And for very practical reasons. One, we didn't need to in a prior philosophy, right? It's changing. Okay, well, if I pump out data from my device, which I know manufacturers are doing, how do I make sense of all of the data? Who do I tell? Is it me? Is it a vendor? Is it FDA? Is it my customer? Like there's some amount of work, non-zero amount of work that needs to be done to take all this information and make meaning of it. But the idea from a policy writing standpoint that you could go out, build a device and never observe its failures, or observe its failures through, was it the form 3500, just doesn't make sense, right? Because technological failures propagate much faster than a clinician sitting down going, what form am I supposed to file? Oh, was it this, did I meet the criteria for MDR reporting under 803, 21 CFR 803? What does that say, right? Like, so this idea that, you have a human in the loop just doesn't make sense. These are technologies. Why can't we just build them to report when they're having issues? So thank you for joining me. That was Demystifying, the FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance. Happy to take any questions now. And thanks for listening. And I can pause for a long time. I'll just sit here. Let's just hang out. Anybody got any questions? I'll just check email. Sweet. Deborah, when will this guidance become a requirement? So I think what you mean is that when the guidance will go final, my guess is sometime in 2023. The comment period ends, and I forgot to mention this. Please do submit your comments. It's open until July 7th-ish. So get it out before the July 4th holiday. The starting point for getting guidances like this out generally are about 9 months from when they finalize off the comments. So the comment period will close July 7th. It takes time to process all the comments, which they do. So I'm guessing sometime in 2023. Now, if Commissioner Califf comes in, he says, I want this out for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, they find a way to get it out. So I would say either October this year or first quarter next year. If you have questions about what MedCrypt does, please reach out to me, Seth@medcrypt.com. Any time frame from Ken. Ken always wants to know what time it's coming out. You got it. Yeah, Aaron, there might be. Hey, Aaron, how you doing? Good to see you, hear from you. Yeah, there might be some examples out there. I haven't not done an extensive search, but you may be able to find some templates. Also, don't be afraid to hit the whiteboard or get some crayons out and a big sheet of paper. On my whiteboard behind me, there may be threat models there as well. So there may be a generic template or specific templates. I know way back when there was some discussion. I think Matt Clapham, who worked at Microsoft and then GE, I think he moved on, was talking about putting some plugins into the Microsoft tool, but I didn't follow that. But there may be some out there. Michael, about the does the FDA always expect a pen test, or would other testing methods suffice? I think if you can make a rational argument of why a pen test isn't necessary, that might fly. But you know, if you've interacted with the agency at all, sometimes the reviewer's just like, please just give it to me. Like, I get what you're saying, but just do it, right? So I think there's an argument that can be made. Whether that's acceptable or not is, a risk going in. One of the things you can do, and I always mention this as pre-submissions, like if you have concerns and you sort of want to get ahead of your timeline, you can ask these questions before review time. That can be helpful. So the guidance document mentions shared responsibility, but falls short of laying guidance for HDOs to maintain security in the operating environment. Is this intentional? Yes, because the FDA has no jurisdiction over hospitals, but it does try to get the technology producers, manufacturers, to get in a position to hand off the baton. So I talked a little bit about labeling. You have to tell your users or hospitals or HDOs and patients even, what do they need to do? Don't make it guesswork for them. So that's as far as the FDA can go. There is one regulation, I think, out there for FDAs on hospitals. I can't remember the site. So my days of regulator, or my regulator hat, ended in 2020, but it basically says, if you see something, say something. This gets back to the, I think, MDR reporting, like there's a death or serious injury. There's a reg site that basically says, hey, you have to report. But other than that, it's FDA regs are silent. How much do you anticipate the FDA will expect pre-market submissions to incorporate this information while it is still in draft? Great question. I was part of conversations where we were including the concepts during review time. Why? Because cybersecurity is a national security issue. So I think the FDA is sort of within their bounds to make the request. How hard they push may be a function of this being in draft, or how hard they push in certain areas may be a function of how solid they are and its necessity given that given cybersecurity's position. Their official position is not for implementation. That's the official position. They may not come out and ask you for specific items, but they may, right? Like there's 700 reviewers at the center. It can get a little variable, right? But the official position, and I know that trade groups will push back if they see them trying to implement draft right before it's final, right? Like if you're not settled on it, why are you asking about it? But you may see something in between. All sounds reasonable. How to structure and how to present it. I see the file being too big very fast without being useful. A valid point. Here's the thing. Whether it was said or not, during my experience at the agency, this is the type of information that we ended up asking for because we couldn't make sense of the cybersecurity posture of any device or system without specific types of information. So while I agree with you, it's a little clunky. There's going to be a lot of documentation or evidentiary basis submitted. I think that will I don't know if it's pare down or get efficient over time, but I think this is a good first stab. Now you can submit comments to the docket where you think it's particularly onerous, or you can work with the agency during pre-submissions. Like, is this enough information to sort of right size it? So I think you're right. And also what I didn't mention is as the cybersecurity program manager when I was there, one of the other things, the tuple to this policy document and all the documents that it would create is that they needed funding and resources, right? And I think if you look towards some of the DUFA discussions and legislative asks, you see that ask come through, which is necessary. So yes, it's going to be painful, big, and FDA needs resources to process it. I do think it'll get efficient over time. John, vuln chaining, how many should be chained? That's a great question. The FDA has not gone into chaining vulnerabilities, but I know in terms of assessing single CVEs, it's a little bit more guesswork than possible. I've heard people trying to implement some form of the attack chain. And I don't know I haven't seen those yet, but in the degree of success that it has. But I think this idea that if I've got a vulnerability here and I got a vulnerability there, it's more risk than any of them singularly, kind of like an attack chain. I kind of mentioned it with the SBOM section where FDA is asking for where the piece of software resides. I think that's kind of getting to that concept. So again, FDA is not asking for it, but the idea of, is it higher resolution and better fidelity in our risk assessment to chain these or think about chaining? Absolutely. How that's done, we'll probably have to borrow from a different industry. The kill chain or attack chain sounds like a good place to start. I think, Ken, you're mentioning that Matt Clapham went to the video game industry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like fun. Maybe I'll do that next. Fabio, should the threat models necessarily include the security controls mentioned in the guidance? I think at some level, yes, right? So they say, hey, what is the information that you need to provide in these architectural views? The architectural views, in my experience, have been sort of distillates of a part of the threat model, and they include interfaces and protocols and security controls. How you come to that is, I think, as an industry, we're still figuring that out in a clean and efficient way. But pictures always help. I was a very picture-based person, so when I reviewed stuff, anytime I got a picture, I was like, I understand this immediately. Tables and tables and tables. I love a good spreadsheet, but if you've got 1,000-row spreadsheet and you're trying to have the reviewer review it, they're going to get lost, right? So how can you, best present that? It's a work in progress. Yeah, how deep of a dive? How to which level of info is enough? Showing context, you agree that showing context is important, but how do we scale and share with the FDA and put in our file? I mean, look, it's a work in progress, right? I know that the files that I've reviewed or been a part of have been very painful. I'm not sure there's any way to get around that, seeing the newness of it, and I think we'll achieve some sort of efficiency as time goes on. There are folks out there that are working with clients to try to make this manageable. But I think this sort of new period, it's just going to be inefficient. What I will say is, what I've experienced is just to even tell the story internally requires a certain level of information. I think that level of information to communicate internally is probably about right for the FDA. So if you got a document that somebody can pick up, maybe in regulatory affairs, maybe quality, and say, oh, okay, I get this, that might be the right level, right? So I think you can use your internal stakeholders as test cases. Thank you for the compliment, Alan. Fabio asked for a map of the guidance security controls. I know people are actively working on it. I'm not sure if there's anything public, but it's the first thing that people want to know. Like, hey, how many of these do I check off? But I know people like to do it internally. Yeah, this idea of Fabio, again, this idea of traceability, super important, right? How do I connect things together? I think the FDA got rid of the traceability matrix in their software guidance. As a reviewer, I love the traceability matrix because I started there, right? I just started and I pulled threads. So I think it's going to be actually important for cybersecurity. If they get rid of it, I would probably build one internally anyway. Cool. We are at time. It was a pleasure to be with you. Hopefully you found this helpful. Feel free to reach out to me at any time, Seth@medcrypt.com. Thanks for time and attention. I know it's precious, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Appreciate it.